Hello, this is Group 2, and we're going to address the intersection of cannabis use and systemic discrimination in the United States. First, let's talk about the brief history of cannabis. The origin is in Central Asia with first recorded record in 2727 BC, and it was also known to ancient Greeks and Romans. In the 1500s, Spain brought hemp to Chile to make things like rope and fiber. During the colonial era in the United States, oil was extracted from the seeds and it was used in things like cooking oil, fuel, and personal care products. In the early to mid 1800s, Western interest in cannabis use as a medical drug grew. In the early 1900s, recreational smoking began among certain population, including African American around music scene and Mexican Americans. In the 1930s, Harry Anslinger started to stigmatize cannabis, and in 1937, Marijuana Tax Act passed, making marijuana illegal, even for farming hemp despite industrial use, but it was overturned in 1969. However, in the 1970s, Controlled Substance Act passed, which aimed to control many different substances with different schedules. This actually shows that stigmatization was not unique to cannabis. Essentially, this is the history of criminalization of many drugs in the United States.
The way cannabis was portrayed in the media heavily influenced the common understanding of social issues that are connected to the history of cannabis, including race, crime, and other drug use. In the 1930s, Harry Anslinger was appointed to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and he had a crusade against marijuana because most of it was based on the racist fear that drugs in the hands of Black people posed a danger to white women and children. And most of his propaganda appealed to fear, and his power allowed for the US government to influence and share that fear with other people in the United States. An example of this is in the picture at the very bottom. This was a 1935 US government advertisement warning about the dangers associated with cannabis, saying it lurks murder, insanity, and death. And as we learned in class, Reefer Madness was also a film that came out around this time that demonized cannabis through exhibiting uncomfortable hallucinations, sexual assault, and attempted murder. It also suggested that marijuana dealers at that time lurked around public schools waiting to entice children, specifically in white families, into a life of crime and degeneracy. Also, around this same time as well, the media began deeming cannabis as a gateway drug to other drugs like heroin.
Media fearmongering led to the passage of these 4 acts that we will be discussing next. First came the Harrison Act, which was passed due to growing alarm with drug addiction and the desire to maintain credibility with our international partners. Congressman Harrison decided to pass the Harrison Act, or the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, in 1914. This was our first major national anti-narcotic law and our first use of federal criminal law to control non-medical use of drugs. This was meant to limit narcotics to scientific and medical use, by controlling the production, sale, and use of opium and cocaine. Marijuana was not included in this act particularly due to resistance in the medical field, but it was grouped into the same type of act with the Marijuana Tax Act, which was passed later on. This required individuals that were involved to pay a special tax, and they had to be registered so that the government could monitor these transactions and the flow of these drugs. Any violations came with a $2,000 fine and or 5 years in prison, and those that were in possession of these drugs needed to provide legal documentation. Medical personnel were also required to keep records of these drugs so that the government could see how they were being prescribed and distributed. So here you can see a special tax stamp that was used. And then due to further fear-mongering by the media, there was the Marijuana Tax Act passed in 1937. It was drafted by Harry Anslinger, who was the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He used really poorly designed research on cannabis and different racial groups for support of this act. He also used the term marijuana to create a strong association with Mexican immigrants and created a narrative around the idea that cannabis made Black people forget their place in society and that jazz was evil music. And so this caused disproportionate arrests of Black and Mexican individuals for violating these laws. So this act placed a tax on the sale of cannabis, and it was very similar to the previous act that we discussed in that it had really hefty fines of $2,000 and or 5 years in prison. And even doctors and pharmacists were required to pay these taxes for prescribing and selling cannabis. And so this demonized cannabis use.
In 1951, the Boggs Act was put in place to establish mandatory minimum sentences and a $2,000 fine for people that were caught doing or selling illegal drugs, mostly targeting narcotics and cannabis. The sentences increased in time the more offenses a person had, reaching as long as 20 years in prison. The new policy helped establish racial boundaries in neighborhoods by arresting people of color entering white neighborhoods. Black and Mexican people were targeted as drug pushers, which are people that go into neighborhoods influencing and selling drugs to white teenagers. Not only does this narrative make white people seem innocent and people of color as predatory and a danger to society, but this caused people of color to be arrested at higher proportions than white people and incarcerated longer for the same crimes. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act was put in place to implement government regulation for the manufacture, importation, possession, use, and distribution of various drugs. This is a policy that officially begun the classification of drugs into 5 categories, where cannabis was listed as a Schedule I drug due to its higher potential for abuse, lack of medical use, lack of safety, and addiction potential that they claimed that it had. But as we know today, cannabis does in fact have medical use and is less addictive than some drugs in the Schedule II category. This policy was put in place by the Nixon administration to link cannabis use and its negative effects with Black people and hippies because their values and actions went against Nixon's agenda.
The war officially began when Nixon declared illicit drugs to be public enemy number 1 and went on to pass the Comprehensive Drug Prevention and Control Act of 1970. This act included the Controlled Substances Act, which put all drugs into an organized system based on addiction potential and medical utility. Following Nixon's resignation, the drug war wasn't as prevalent during the Carter presidency, but things picked back up when Reagan was elected and served from 1980 to 1988. The Carter administration introduced compassionate investigational new drug programs where cannabis was medically used for the treatment of an expanding number of life and sense-threatening diseases. This program ended under the Bush administration in fear that the public would view cannabis in a better light. Following President Carter, Reagan came in and passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established mandatory minimum prison sentences for certain drug offenses. This law was later heavily criticized as having racist ramifications because it allocated longer prison sentences for offenses involving the same amount of crack cocaine, used more often by Black Americans, as powder cocaine, used more often by white Americans. 5 grams of crack triggered an automatic 5-year sentence, while it took 500 grams of powder cocaine to merit the same sentence. George H.W. Bush launched Operation Green Merchant, which was a nationwide investigation and operation targeting businesses advertising specialized horticulture equipment that was supposedly used to grow cannabis in the 1990s.
So with respect to legalization, under federal law, cannabis, THC, these are illegal under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. However, with state laws, we know that medical and recreational legality varies, right? Some states have legalized marijuana, some states have not. And so you may be asking, how can state laws directly violate federal laws, right? And so this comes under the idea of preemption. So federal preemption is essentially a provision under the Article 6, which is the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, and that states that federal law simply trumps state law. And so preemption falls into 3 categories. Express preemption, which is the main one, which is essentially that in the statute, Congress says that we have express intent, right? And essentially any state law that directly violates that statute is unconstitutional. However, in Controlled Substances Act does not have any express preemption. So then we move into field and conflict, which are the other 2 subcategories. So preemption, the field preemption states that basically Congress wants to occupy the legislative field, right, in that case. But the problem is, in the Controlled Substances Act, field preemption is actually revoked because Congress says we have no intent to occupy the field. So it's going to fall down into conflict preemption, where state and federal law have to be in direct violation of one another, right? That are obstacles of one another in order for the state law to be unconstitutional. This becomes very difficult, as you imagine, because it's very difficult to prove that state laws are in direct violation of a federal law when it's just more of an imaginary what-if scenarios. So you need to have direct proof, which is very difficult to obtain. So the reason Congress actually does not really have preemption occurring with the Controlled Substances Act is because they don't want to be responsible for policing everyone, right? So they know the states or the local law enforcement, they're doing their jobs well because 99% plus of drug-related offenses and arrests are made at a local level. So why should the federal government get involved in that? The Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018, which was just recently passed and signed into law by Trump, basically deschedulized hemp from the Controlled Substances Act, and except it's still kept in marijuana and THC. It has strong Republican backing because a lot of the Republicans' constituents are farmers and agricultural people from agricultural backgrounds, and so this really helped their constituents. Finally, looking into the legalization territory of complete legalization of marijuana, a proposed bill is called the Marijuana Justice Act of 2019, which is sponsored by Cory Booker and co-sponsored by Kamala Harris, who was the senator at the time. It essentially does two things. First, it strikes out marijuana, THC, marijuana cigarettes out of the Controlled Substances Act, but also it of course prohibits removes the prohibition of import-export of cannabis, but also, more importantly, addresses the disproportionate arrest rates of low-income individuals and people of color. And so, if that is occurring, right, states will feel that because they're going to rescind their funds for law enforcement and for building prisons. So, losing money makes the states, then take into action. Oh, maybe we should do something about this. So that's all I have to say for legalization.
While cannabis use is legal in some states, it is illegal at the federal level. Current policies limit the ability to conduct research on cannabis and also contribute to systemic racism. Despite cannabis usage rates between whites and non-whites being similar, Black Americans are arrested for cannabis offenses 4 times the rate of whites. These policies affect an enormous number of Americans. In addition, offenses involving drugs are the most common reasons for arrests by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. For non-US citizens, drug violations are an automatic detention and deportation, and most likely results in a ban to never return. After illegal entry, drug offenses were the most common cause of deportation in 2019. An example of an immigration-related drug violation case is from Carachuri Rosendo versus Holder. Jose Angel Carachuri Rosendo became a lawful permanent US resident in 1993. And more than 10 years later, he pled guilty to a misdemeanor possession of marijuana. And a year after, he pled guilty to misdemeanor possession of Xanax, but was not tried as a recidivist. 1 year following his second drug offense, he was notified that he was removable from the US. He applied for removal cancellation, which was denied by the Board of Immigration Appeals, as they claimed that the second drug offense could have been punished as a felony charge. Fortunately, the Supreme Court overturned the ruling, stating that a minor drug offense is not automatic grounds for deportation of a legal immigrant, and the record cannot be enhanced after the fact.
Hi, my name is Alison Pineda, and I'll be going over the research portion of the cannabis presentation. So to start off, I'm just going to go over a really brief outline of what research has looked like over the years in the US regarding cannabis. So in the year 1940, CBD was first isolated from cannabis, but its structure wasn't recorded until the 1960s. And the 1960s is a really significant year because we really see a push in demand for further investigation, specifically focused on the endocannabinoid system. And this was mainly because of the constant social and political problems that were constantly on the rise associated with the legalization of cannabis for recreational use as well as medicinal use. And in the year 2017, the US National Academy of Medicine reported the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids, but all the studies and research that was related to this, they claimed that they needed to go back and do further research. And in this study for the National Academy of Medicine, it only acknowledged cannabis to be affected and limited to these 3 categories. The first one being used as an alleviation for chronic pain in adults. The second one being used as an antiemetic in the treatment of chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. And the third as an improvement in patient-reported multiple sclerosis resistant symptoms. And as you can see, this is really only for the medicinal aspect of cannabis. And this has to do with a lot of the studies out there. It's really because of a lot of the legalization of cannabis that really restrains research and studies. And because of this, a lot of data out there is very biased because they are, especially if it's government funded, we see a pattern that government funded programs of research in cannabis tend to put out data in a way that shows cannabis in a negative light. But if we could move past these legal restraints, future research would really need to dive deeper into investigating the psychomimetic effects of THC, and it would also need to further investigate different demographics. And I think this one's really important because there's a lot of gray area when it comes to the effects of THC in their 70s or 80s, and I feel like that could be really important, especially because of its pain relieving effects. And the third one for future research would be to investigate the residual effects. I know there's a lot of research out there that already has data on residual effects of cannabis, but I believe this could be very limited and skewed because there's a lot of unsupervised periods before and after testing, and I believe they would need to be further examined. That would be a good plan for future research.
This portion of this presentation will be discussing if legalization has corrected past injustices caused by cannabis prohibition. So as seen in previous slides, prohibition has disproportionately affected people of color. For example, arrest rates for African Americans were 4 times higher than whites, and having harsh consequences for conviction, an example in Texas being seen here. So the ideal scenario for legalization is that it benefits those who experience the most harm, which is marginalized populations and people of color, and taxes from the cannabis trade to be used to rebuild affected communities caused by the drug war and drug prohibition. So Brian Adenoff and Amanda Ryman reviewed government documents, white papers, and lay publications to determine if cannabis legal states enacted new procedures to remove harms of prior convictions, to see if arrests and convictions have decreased with legalization, to see if implementation of new programs have assured minority access to legal cannabis industry, and if tax revenues have been used for restorative programs. So some conclusions they made was that expungement is ineffective. And if you didn't know, expungement is the US legal process where prior convictions and arrests are removed in the eyes of the court. And exclusion from the cannabis industry, with a number of obstacles being put into place to obtain a cannabis license. And an example of this is high licensing fees. A racial bias still persists, with arrests for cannabis violations still being double for Blacks and whites, and laws protecting the user but not the supplier. And usually the supplier includes people of color and marginalized populations. And no targeted programs for restorative justice. With politicians, they usually, to get cannabis legalized, they recommend that cannabis tax revenue to be used for education and enforcement, rather than reinvesting in those affected communities.
The future of cannabis. This research article discusses and reviews the current state of knowledge regarding marijuana and its adverse health effects. They note that marijuana is an addictive substance and can have adverse effects if used long-term. However, they also discuss the medical benefits as well. They do this because, like they say in the paper, future research and policy should be done with unbiased standards to properly assess the harmfulness of certain drugs. They also note that there are legal drugs on the market like alcohol and tobacco that have way worse health effects but are legal due to biases against marijuana. Future legalization should focus on its effects on the economy and how this legalization could potentially impact public health. Some recommendations for future legalization efforts. The push for legalization should not forget its origins in social justice and should be done with social justice in mind. The taxes should be based on data rather than assumptions related to alcohol and tobacco harms. Taxes and revenue earned should be used to support restorative justice and communities that have been heavily affected by years and years of cannabis prohibition. And finally, we need to balance the penalties for illicit cannabis use, cultivation, transport, and dispensing once marijuana becomes fully legalized, without having to use a heavily punitive system. On top of that, we also need to work on speedy expungement of previous crimes related to cannabis convictions. Thank you.